So, Benjamin and I are going to talk with you about stress, trauma, and regulation in the voice studio. And to be clear, we're not going to talk about specific trauma. We're not going to take anybody down a scary path, I hope. But instead, we're talking about this from the perspective that in order to create environments where students do feel welcome from day one, where students can come from a variety of backgrounds and experiences and feel safe enough to learn, that it's important for us as educators to know a little bit about stress, trauma, and the way that those things affect both our bodies and our singing voices so that we can get folks into the right headspace to do the work that they're paying us to do for them, which is teach them how to sing. So this research comes from Benjamin did a lovely dissertation, which we've referenced there at the end, which you'll get to see. And then I've been working as an intimacy director, which a big part of that work is studying trauma and the effects of trauma. So this is where our work is rooted. So to take you through just the general format of our presentation, we're going to do a little grounding exercise just to kind of get ourselves in the room and in the space, in the headspace to talk about this. We're going to offer some definitions about what it is that we mean when we're talking about stress and trauma. We're going to review some physiological responses to stress and trauma, and then discuss the impact that those responses have on singers. And then we'll conclude with offering some practical strategies. Again, we love the things that you can take and immediately do. And so we will try to do our best to give you some specific tools that you can take and use right away.
Yes, greetings everyone. My name is Benjamin Czarnota, and I'm truly honored to be here with you all and to be included among these fine presenters and alongside my old friend, not saying you're old, but you know what I mean,
Yeah.
Andrea. It has been an absolute blessing to reconnect with such a fine human being. Now, before we begin, I want to be clear regarding about what this topic is and isn't about. It is not about lowering standards or simply making things easier for students. In fact, it may be the opposite. If we care about high standards, we also have to care about whether students are actually able to learn in a way that is repeatable and reliable. Because we've all seen this. Students who work hard, produce something successfully in the moment, but can't consistently return to it. That's not a motivation issue. That's not always a technical issue. Often it's a condition issue. And what we're exploring today is how those conditions, particularly physiological and psychological state, as impacted by stress and then trauma as sort of a subcategory of the larger umbrella of stress science, and how they shape what we teach, whether what we teach actually becomes learning. And before we get into definitions or strategies, we want to take a moment to ask a central question that guides this entire session. What state is our student in when they are trying to learn? In voice teaching, we often focus on the content we're teaching, technique, repertoire, interpretation. But that learning doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in an internal context, shaped by the environment, the demands of the task, and the energy in the room. Consequently, another question becomes just as important. What state are we in when we are trying to teach? When we talk about state, we're talking about one's current physiological and psychological condition, what one's body is doing, what one's attention is doing. Are we calm or are we agitated, focused or scattered, regulated or overwhelmed? That state directly affects what we can perceive, either as students or as teachers, importantly, what we can coordinate, and what we are able to retain. So let's take a minute to notice our current state. This particular exercise is something I use with students regularly. Not as relaxation first and foremost, but as a way of observing what state we're in before we try to learn, teach, or perform. First, take a moment and either write down or just mentally note 2 or 3 words that describe your life experience right now. Then, just allow your breath to move naturally. Your attention to its flow in and out is the singular objective. So there's no need to change it. No need to do it the right way. Just notice movement. Where it's happening, how it feels. As anything else comes into your awareness, a thought, a sound, a physical sensation, imagine placing it on a small flag and setting it off to the side in your mind. Not getting rid of it, just noticing it without holding on to it. Then, simply return your attention to your breathing and wait for the next thing to arise. Okay, I'll see you all in a minute, starting now. Welcome back. Hopefully you didn't all hear my son drumming upstairs. If you did, maybe you flagged it. I don't know. I certainly did. Again, just notice what 2 or 3 words describe your state now. If you'd like, you can drop 1 or 2 of these words into the chat. In all likelihood, what you felt was a range of responses. A range of feelings, thoughts. That variability is exactly what we're working with in our studio every day. So even small shifts like this, before and after, can directly affect attention, coordination, and learning. Now, when we use the word stress, we often mean something negative, something to reduce or eliminate. But stress is the body's adaptive response, the human response to a perceived demand. And here's the important distinction. Not all stress is the problem. Acute, task-linked stress, the kind that is connected to what the student is doing, can actually enhance focus and support learning. But chronic or diffuse stress, the kind that is not tied to the task at hand or that accumulates over time, begins to interfere. It interferes with coordination, attention, and especially encoding and recall. So the goal is not to eliminate stress. The goal is to shape the conditions in the studio so that stress remains exciting and enhancing rather than overwhelming. Importantly, stress is not just physical, this physical experience that I'm feeling. For singers, the perceived challenge that initiates the stress response can come from multiple sources. Environmental stress, things like time pressure, performance settings, or the demands of the task itself. Social stress, evaluation, real or imagined, comparison, the dynamics between teacher and student. Developmental stress, this is identity formation, skill acquisition, or even transitions in training. And finally, though this list isn't exhaustive, psychological stress. How the student appraises their own abilities in relation to the challenge in front of them determines aspects of the stress response, whether it will be a singular, momentary occurrence or whether it is something that starts to snowball. All of these are active in the room at once, and all of them shape how a student learns and performs. In addition, not all stress functions in the same way. When a challenge is within a student's perceived capacity, it may be experienced as what is called eustress, and it can actually support focus, engagement, adaptability, and learning or performance more generally. But when when stress exceeds that capacity, it can become distress and it begins to interfere. Attention narrows, coordination becomes unstable, and learning becomes much more difficult. So, our goal as teachers is to recognize where a student's stress level is on that experiential spectrum at any given point in time, and to keep students within a range where optimal learning and performance is possible. Now, on to trauma.
So, trauma is a word that I think has become a little overused and a little bit reductive in some cases, right? Kid will say, "Oh, I'm so traumatized by this," or "I'm triggered by this," right? And so I think it's important to know that when we're talking about trauma, we are using the DSM definition, which is the diagnostic manual used by psychologists and psychiatrists when they are diagnosing emotional and mental distress. And trauma in this case is a stressful occurrence that falls outside the realm of normal experience. And that can range from death or threat of death to natural disaster to war to consistent exposure to oppression or coercion, right? Importantly, these things don't actually have to happen to a person for them to be traumatic, but hearing about them, knowing someone who has been deeply affected by this can actually engender the same physical response in a person as if they are actually going through it themselves. The World Health Organization estimates that 70% of the global population will experience something traumatic in their lifetime. And so, just going by numbers, that means that a large portion of the students that we encounter will likely have had some kind of exposure to a traumatic event. We don't need to know what that event is. And importantly, it is not our job to help them process trauma or fix trauma. We are not therapists or mental health professionals, most of us. Some of us have that additional certification. But our job is to help them learn how to use their voices. So when we're talking about trauma and being aware that trauma exists, it's not so much so that we can help them fix it. It's just about creating a space where, as Justin said, students are welcomed in on day one, right? That we are creating an environment where they can feel accepted and included. Importantly, I think for singers is that remembering something that's happened, imagining something traumatic, or even play acting through it also provides the same physical response as if it was happening, which is why now trauma research indicates things like talk therapy is not very helpful when it comes to processing traumatic events because it literally encodes those feelings into your body over and over and over again. The other thing that's important to know about trauma is that every single body has a different capacity for handling it and experiences it in really different ways. So, when we're talking about building inclusive spaces or building spaces that are quote unquote safe, it's very difficult for us to do that because every single person experiences things differently. So it's really about just being as broad and expansive as possible in the spaces that we're building so that regardless of past experience, regardless of a person's ability to process trauma or process stress, they can thrive in our studio environment. The other thing just to be aware of is it usually takes about 30 minutes for our body to resettle itself after a threat has been perceived. And so for a lot of us, that's a majority of our lesson time. So we want to make sure that nothing about our studio creates threat for a student, right? So that we can really focus on that work of what it is that we're being paid to do. So Benjamin is now going to take us through what some of those responses look like to stress and trauma.
Yeah, so we're about to look under the hood a little more specifically, but we've already got a clear distinction hopefully emerging, which is to say the stress response is human, right? It's universal. It's something that we actually want. Traumatic stress specifically is one subset of what we would call dysregulated stress, where for whatever reason the stress response that we need goes a little bit haywire. And so we just need to be aware of that distinction, as they can sort of get muddled. But yeah, so to understand how stress impacts singing, we need a simple model of how the body normally regulates its state. The autonomic nervous system is constantly regulating our physiological state, often outside of conscious awareness. And that state directly shapes how a singer breathes, coordinates, attends, and ultimately learns. These states, importantly, are not good or bad. They are human. They are adaptive responses to a perceived demand. The goal is not to eliminate activation, but to support flexibility, the ability to move between states as needed. So when a perceived threat is gone, the body downregulates in a normal period of time. That doesn't occur, as Andrea was just saying, with somebody who has experienced significant traumatic stress. So, yeah, when flexibility is not present, an individual may become stuck in patterns of either overactivation on one end or shutdown on the other. Broadly speaking, we can think about two primary mechanisms within the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is associated with mobilization. It prepares the body for action. Not a bad thing. But in singers, this can show up as increased breath urgency, higher breaths sometimes, muscular tension globally, top to bottom, and compromised breath management, pushing. These are not simply technical problems in these moments. They're responses to perceived demands. On the other side, this parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for regulation and restoration. When it is dominant, we often see a release of unnecessary tension, more stable breath flow, increased sensory awareness, and reliable coordination. Both these systems serve an essential purpose. We need activation to perform at high levels. We need regulation in order to stay in balance, in order to stay receptive, etc. The issue arises when a singer becomes stuck in either chronic overactivation or, again, in a kind of shutdown, potentially lacking motivation or even interest. When that happens, technical instruction alone is often not sufficient because the underlying state is not supporting coordination and learning. This is where our role shifts. We are not just correcting technical behavior, but helping to create conditions where our students' autonomic nervous system can regulate itself. When it can't, students resort to survival patterns. Andrea, back to you.
So these are survival patterns that tend to emerge as a result of overactivation of either the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system. And each one is sort of affiliated with different ones. And we have a lovely handout for you that will make this very clear later. But I think most of us are likely familiar with fight or flight. I think those are the two we hear about the most often. Fight is the tendency to confront the threat that you perceive. In voice students, this can look like pushback against a request, right? Or demands for explanation of like why you want me to do that, right? We all have those kiddos that are our little function children. They want to know exactly why you're asking them every single moment. And sometimes that can come kind of as this response to a perceived threat. And in that case, it's us as the person in power over them. Another response is flight, and that's the desire to escape from the perceived threat. For those in voice students, sometimes that is it okay if we stop 5 minutes early because I need to go do XYZ, right? Or it's a sort of a physical withdrawal from your space, right? They step away from you. You have to look for nonverbal signals to indicate these states as well. Freeze is the student who just hopes to escape your notice. They don't want any attention from you, positive or negative, right? They just kind of want to show up and do their thing and go away. Fawn is one we see quite a bit, and some folks call that befriend the threat, right? That you are going to, if you love me enough, you won't hurt me, is kind of the general thought there. That looks a lot like over people pleasing. It looks like bending over backwards to do anything that anyone asks of them, whether it is personally harmful or not. And again, this is something we see a lot in places where we have uneven power balances, right? Where a student perceives that we control so much about them that they want to make sure that we are giving them what they need to be successful as students. And then flop is the one that comes in this state of total collapse. I once had a student actually faint in studio class because in her little nervous system, the safest option for her was to just go to sleep and hope that it was over when she woke up, right? So we can see all of these things. Importantly, as Benjamin said, these are patterns that emerge that are dictated for us a lot of the time. These are not things that we choose. It is our body's response to save us from whatever it is that's going on. And in folks that have experienced trauma, a lot of the time, these responses overtake the logical brain and they are not able to get out of them. Even in folks who have not experienced trauma, you might recognize glimmers of these in terms of your own response to perceived threat or situations that can be difficult. Bessel
Yeah.
van der Kolk is I'm sorry, Benjamin, just one more
No,
more,
no, no.
and then I'll let you jump
You're
in.
great.
He is probably the primary researcher on trauma. He did a lot of work, particularly with PTSD, and specifically, and is the one who has sort of codified a lot of our understanding, our modern understanding of what trauma is. And this quote from him, I think, is just helpful for us to know that trauma is not just something that happened to us in the past, it's the imprint that was left by that experience. And so just because you should be quote unquote over it doesn't mean that you ever are, right? It exists in your body and your brain. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah. So, and Andrea, you already went here a little bit, but the idea that these understanding these survival patterns is central to understanding dysregulated traumatic stress when it does go haywire. But it's important to note that specifically the fight or flight aspect, which was coined by Walter Cannon in the early 20th century, wasn't thinking about trauma at all. He was working with athletes and looking at the stress response in athletes, talking about how they mobilized for elite performance. And he coined the term fight or flight. So we needn't, it's important that either ourselves or our students not dismiss these patterns or these responses as something that only people with life altering trauma deal with. They happen on let's say lesser levels, less acute or really obstructive levels with all of us. And recognizing these patterns makes us see what's going on with our students and helps us teach better.
So, Emily Coriath has written a fantastic book that I really encourage you all to look at. It's called Trauma and the Voice. That was the topic of our first little virtual book club that we did in January. We'll do another one soon on a different book, and that is just, you don't even have to read the book, you just come and we just talk about the book. So, if you don't have time, it's a great way to get some new knowledge. So, look for a future book club announcement soon. But Emily says in her book that singers in particular are primed to be more activated, in great part because of performance pressure, because of the stress that comes with that, because singers tend to be a little more in tune with their emotion, and because they also are dealing with like the vulnerability of putting themselves out there, worry about whether or not it's going to go well. And then on top of all of that, we have content that we have to sing, right? And a lot of the time, that content can be about things that are very difficult. And so, and again, trauma studies tell us that our body cannot tell the difference between pretend and real.
Mm-hmm.
So, your singers may walk in totally regulated and then sing a piece of music that ends with the death of the character. And then by the end of the lesson, they're in this state of activation. And you may wonder what the heck just happened. Well, they had a physiological response to the content, right? So this is why we think it's important to know this and to kind of be able to put some protocols in place that make your studio a space where folks can get to a place of really not so much safety, but what we say in intimacy world is a space of acceptable risk, right? Where they know that their boundaries are going to be honored and that you'll stop when they need to stop and you'll help them reset and you'll put conditions in place that keep them sort of narrowly contained.
Yeah, great.
Mhm.
So this sympathetic activation impacts vital processes for singing. First, memory. The state a singer is in directly affects both how experiences are encoded and how they are later retrieved. When a student is in a regulated, manageable state, new coordinations and concepts are more likely to be encoded clearly and stored in ways that can be accessed again. But when stress exceeds their capacity, that encoding process becomes less reliable. And we see this in lessons. Sometimes something works once, but the student can't replicate it. Retrieval is also state dependent. If something is learned in one physiological state, it may be difficult to access in another, especially under pressure. So a student may demonstrate something successfully in studio, but not in performance. Not because they don't know it or they forgot what they were doing technically, but because their state has changed. This suggests that what we're really aiming for is not just successful moments in a lesson or masterclass, but an awareness and experience of those moments that makes the new approach practicable and repeatable across states.
A lot of the time we see these dysregulation states evident in their breath, right? High breath, tight breath, running out of air. I think that breath is often a clue as to how our students are actually doing. Happily, the breath is the number one thing that you can do to help bring yourself into a regulated state, to the point that a lot of therapists actually prescribe singing to students who deal with a lot of, or the clients who deal with anxiety or stress or trauma because of the way that we control breath when we're singing. It's interesting to you, but I think it's important to know that breath is both the clue to something being dysregulated and also a solution.
Yeah, yeah, that's so often the case, right? And so yeah, not being afraid of where a symptom is showing up, because sometimes lingering there can uncork a solution.
Mhm.
So coordination is equally shaped by state. Under conditions of increased stress, singers don't default to optimal coordination. They default to familiar and or protective patterns. These might include breath holding or restriction, increased tension in the jaw, tongue, neck, again, pushing from a breath standpoint, or even a loss of flexibility across registers, vocal registers. Once again, these are not technical failures in these cases. They are the result of adaptive responses to perceived demand. So, when we see these patterns, the question is not simply what is wrong technically. It becomes what state is this coordination emerging from? And that shift in perspective changes how we respond as teachers. We're no longer just correcting behavior, we're addressing the conditions that are shaping it.
And then Chad spoke to us beautifully about executive function, right? And that is another thing, another place where we often see these survival patterns emerge. So we don't need to go into that in depth, but basically we know that our students struggle a bit with learning, planning, prioritizing tasks, etc. And so if that's something that you're running into repeatedly with students and they're not responding necessarily when you're trying to help them learn, it might be worth asking some questions about or doing a little assessing about what their actual state is so that we can actually help them learn better. So I think at this point, we're going to, because we recognize we just gave you a lot of science, we wanted to kind of pause and see if there were any questions at this moment, clarifying questions, comments, anything that you wanted to ask before we move into kind of some strategies for creating these environments that we're talking about.
And you can either use the raise hand feature or pop questions in the chat
Mhm.
if you don't feel like being on the spot. But if we have an abundance of clarity, we can also move on. Are you seeing anything, Andrea?
I'm not. No, let's keep
Okay.
going.
Well, I tell you
Hmm.
what, it's all about the application, right?
That's
How
right.
might we apply this in the studio,
Hmm.
Andrea?
Hmm. So, as we've said, we're talking about creating conditions for learning, and there are six areas that give us some concepts, larger concepts to think about. And this comes from the field of trauma-informed voice care, which again, Emily discusses really beautifully in her book. And then there's a trauma and voice or trauma-informed voice group that has formed and is doing a lot of really important research about this. So, in general, when we're thinking about these six areas of work that we can do, we're talking about creating an orientation towards being in the present moment. We are trying to encourage an environment that prioritizes self-inquiry and thinking about observation rather than correction. And so the six areas that we want to think about are listed there. So first, safety. And again, that's a tricky one because safety means so many different things to so many different people. So ideally, we are trying to create a place where students know what's expected of them. Again, in intimacy work, I always say I cannot promise you that I will keep you safe, but I can promise you that I will make sure that you are confident, that you know what is being asked of you, and you know how to be successful in doing it, right? So that it's really about reducing uncertainty. And that goes a long way to helping folks feel both physically and psychologically safe in a place because they understand what the environment is, right? And that goes a long way towards building number two, which is trust. And that is something that we as teachers have a lot of control over. If we are transparent about what we're doing, we create a space that is ethically clear, and we do work with our students to understand that we're not going to smash them as they're learning. It helps to build an environment where they feel like they can rely on us as learning partners, not just as people telling them what to do. A big part of this is peer support. Justin mentioned this a bit. Are there studio outings that you can do? But we know that access to folks who come from similar places, who have similar interests, go a long way to making us a feeling of belonging. And I think that is what most of us are aiming for in our voice studios. Collaboration is really important. I mentioned being partners in learning, and I think that, Chad mentioned this in his presentation as well, this old model of this master teacher apprentice student that has been part of voice culture, and I would argue classical music culture for a really long time, is a model that is not really working very well with today's youth. Their brains are just different. They're wired differently, their attention spans are different. And the days of I'm an open vessel, pour your knowledge into me is just not something that keeps students particularly engaged or feeling particularly invested in their learning, right? So anything that we can do that invites the students into the next bit, empowerment, voice, and choice, right? Becoming active participants in their learning is super, super helpful. Chad also mentioned the power dynamic issue in the studio. And, for a lot of students, not only are we giving them information about their voices, helping them to be better, but we also represent industry connections to them. We are holders of grades, right? We are many times very valued adults and mentors in their lives, and that is a lot of pressure on the relationship, right? In that we can really crush them really fast, and we won't even know that we did it, right? So it's just about making sure that we're paying attention to the way that we involve the students in their learning. Also, too, thinking about cultural, historical, and gender issues, we need to be very aware that, there are people who have not had great experiences with people in positions of power. Um, we have populations, entire swaths of our population that have been historically diminished, that have been coerced. Anybody who falls outside the cis white heteronormative construct has faced things that those of us in that category cannot imagine, right? And it's important that we educate ourselves about that. It's important that we're just very responsive to our students and what they need. So that is a lot of conceptual thoughts. Ben's now going to take us through what some specific practices are that we can put in place.
Yeah, yeah, and again, like the idea that like these are all principles that would likely benefit all students, regardless of whether of what their particular history may be, because every instruction we give is being filtered. It's being filtered through a student's current state. This means the teaching is not just delivering content, it's creating a context in which that content can be learned most effectively. So, what does it look like? Let's review some of the ways of shaping the conditions in which learning occurs. First, co-regulation. As teachers, our state influences our students' state, the way that we speak, pace, exercises, or repertoire work, and respond can all increase pressure or create stability and regulation. Research even suggests that elevated teacher stress can directly influence student cortisol levels. Directly. So how we manage ourselves and our own energy, our own stress, etc., may inadvertently cause student stress levels to peak. What else? We can implement language shifts, moving from evaluation to observation generally. From what does that feel like, or did that feel good, to what do you notice? This encourages awareness without immediately framing the experience as right or wrong, good or bad. Chad just spoke of this so eloquently about guiding awareness and self-assessment in a manner that is both kind and honest, so we can reflect on what we've just done. And again, that's what they end up hopefully doing in the practice room. What else? We scaffold learning using calibrated challenges, right? Based on the student's state and ability. Not just from semester to semester or year to year, but from moment to moment. An exciting challenge one week may be overwhelming the next. So we adjust in real time. We try to keep the student working at the edge of their capacity and not beyond it. Finally, we can implement micro practices. These are small interventions that are embedded into normal teaching. For example, when working on breathing, let's say a silent breathing exercise, we could pace the breath. Slightly longer exhalations, slowing to around 5 to 7 breaths per second, they say, supports autonomic regulation. Mm-hmm. We might pause between repetitions to allow integration rather than immediately correcting. Kate's mental rehearsal exercise from earlier today could well serve to help regulate a student spiraling from perfectionism or eagerness to please. It gets the focus off of, I know that was wrong, let me do it again, to let's pause, reflect, and then make a choice with agency. Or we might simply use a physical reset. If we see a student who's struggling with, let's say, global muscular tension, something like briefly raising the shoulders for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then releasing them can interrupt patterns of excess tension in this area that is so pivotal. These and many other interventions impact the stress response and regulation, but can be done in the context of voice work, technical work, and they take very little time. And they can significantly shift a student's state away from momentary dysregulation toward one that supports learning. These are not ways of making things easier. They are ways of making learning more reliable.
So I think this can be really overwhelming when you start to like think about how many people are struggling in the world, right? And then here we are, one little voice teacher with one very tender soul standing in front of us. So what the heck are we supposed to do with this, right? How do we integrate this into our work? Um, a big part of this is like talk to your students and then listen to what they say, right? I've started to, as Chad mentioned, like set goals with my students. What are your goals for the day? And then usually whatever their goals are pretty close to what my goals are, or I can find ways to like do what I'm hoping to do within the structure that they've set out, right? But as Benjamin said, what is really an exciting challenge one day may be overwhelming a different day. And so giving the students like the ability to express that to us and then doing it is goes a long way to helping them feel like we actually care about them as humans more than paychecks, right? The second thing that we need to do is attend to rupture. And rupture is something that kind of comes from philosophy and thinking about harm, unintentional harm. We harm each other all the time, and most of the time it's unintentional. As the adult in the room, it is our job to fix those, right? And this can look like all kinds of things. You make an awkward joke that you think is funny and it just clearly does not land with the person, right? Or perhaps you misgender someone and you feel really bad about it. Call it out and say it, right? It's about accountability and demonstrating accountability. As Benjamin said, the way that we comport ourselves directly affects the way that our students feel. And so, us modeling this way of like, accountability and harm and repairing harm is really important, not only for being effective in an ethical relationship with each other, but also teaching students how to people outside their voice lessons too. We need to teach our students self-compassion and we need to practice it for ourselves too. I think that we as teachers are very generous with our students. We are not so with ourselves, right? And part of that is noticing when you're being self-critical. So I will gently call out Justin for saying that he's a toddler pianist. I do the same thing with my students. I call myself Mittens when I'm at the piano, right? And because I make a lot of mistakes and I have a good relationship with the keyboard, but I am not a pianist. However, I noticed that when I would do that, when I would be sort of self-deprecating with myself, when they would sit down to self-accompany, or when they were self-accompanying and singing, immediately I'm not very good at this, or I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. And I noticed that they started to adopt that mode of communication. And I thought, oh, I'm teaching them something that I don't want them to do. I don't want them to have those feelings. So um, it's important. It's just knowing how much we affect their energy and their state, I think is just really important. And then we can help them figure out how to soften the little critic voice that lives in their head, right? We all have that little guy that lives in there who says things like, well, that wasn't very good, or well, you messed that up, or oh, you forgot those words again, you dink, right? So, like, helping them turn that little critical guy into a helper instead of somebody that's just hurting their own feelings over and over again, right? And you can literally say, I know you're trying to help, little voice in my head, but you're being hurtful, right? Can you help me reframe this into something that's usable? Again, that's something that we can model and we can teach our students that that little voice in our head should be our most compassionate friend, not somebody who's trying to hurt our feelings intentionally.
Yeah, so hopefully you're getting the sense that this is not about becoming a mental health practitioner at all. We don't need to be experts in mental health to just have an awareness of our own state and to cultivate an awareness of our students' state. That's really what we're advocating for. Um, but to start wrapping up, as I've said, it's not about making lessons easier or lowering standards. It's about trying to increase the likelihood that students can actually meet the standards that either we set, they set, the industry sets, etc. It's about understanding the conditions that determine whether learning actually occurs. Because a student can produce something successfully in a single moment. But if their state doesn't support encoding and retrieval, that moment doesn't reliably become learning. Over time, that difference compounds. And it's the difference between a student who occasionally accesses something under ideal conditions and a student who can return to optimal coordination consistently and independently from us. Most of us were trained to evaluate what we can hear and what we see, the technical adjustments that are necessary. Yeah? Today, we're asking you to also evaluate the conditions under which that sound is being produced, experienced, and learned. This is not an add-on to pedagogy. It's foundational. It is part of the underlying structure that determines whether what we teach actually lasts. So to really bring this to a close, learning is not just about the material that we present. It's about the state in which that material is experienced. And as teachers, we are always influencing that state, whether we are aware of it or not. So, the opportunity is to do that intentionally. Because ultimately, we are not just teaching technique, we are shaping the conditions under which learning becomes possible. Many thanks.
Mhm. So, and then with the in the spirit of chat, are you going to get something for free? Yes, I'm dropping into the chat right
Yes.
now a handout that we prepared for you that sort of gives you some of the highlights of what we mentioned and has a bunch of sources that you might enjoy engaging with on the other side. Some really good books, articles. Some of our articles are there, but we do have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to entertain them. Mhm. Thank you for all your clapping hands. That's nice.
I just have a really quick question since I had to leave and go teach and come back. If
Mhm.
Chad dropped something in the chat, I didn't get to download it. So if he could do
Mm.
that again, I would so appreciate that.
Chad had a QR at the end of his presentation, which we
Okay,
would have been recording and will post, so that you'll be able
perfect.
to grab it that way.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
hmm Any other questions, either for us or any of the folks who presented today?
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to when you have goals for a student that they aren't necessarily aware of. Like, for example, if I have a student who's got a really tense belt and they've always had a tense belt. They're not aware that it's causing any issues. Maybe it's causing intonation issues or vocal health issues, but they're not aware of it. So it's not one of their goals.
Mm.
Or if they come in singing wrong pitches and rhythms and they're not aware of it, it's not one of their goals. How do you approach those things that just aren't even on their radar?
It's a great question. Can I start, Ben?
Yeah, of
Benjamin, I'll
course.
let you jump in. So the way that I've engaged with that, because that does happen, right? We know that, bless them, they think they know everything a lot of the time and they don't, right? Is I will say things like, my experience as an audience member is blank. Like when I see that you are doing this, this is the goal that you're trying to do, and my experience of it is I'm hearing a very tight belt and it's distracting me from your goal because it doesn't align with what I'm seeing, right? Or it doesn't align with what I think the character is. So that if you can turn it into that, it's not that it's what you're doing is bad, it's just that you're trying to do X and X is not what the result is, then it can sometimes be a helpful reframe for them so that they can it at least opens them up to experimenting some other ways. This is great in like studio class because you can turn to others and be like, what was your experience? Like, what do you hear when so and so does it this way? What's your version of that? And that can help it become one of their goals without you being like, you're wrong, you know? Benjamin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and what I if we're going to avoid I'm right, you're wrong, as Andrea just said, like it's my belief that someone has to experience the benefit of a different priority. And what can happen, specifically as it relates to the stress response, right? Or the stress response and perfectionism tend to go very much hand in hand, and people end up functioning at an elevated stress level, and they truly don't know it. Selye wrote about general adaptation syndrome, is what he called it, and it's the whole idea that our bodies can be elevated, but there are normalizing factors that enable us to function at those elevated levels, and we don't even realize that we are escalated. So, with basic practices, hopefully embedded in a way that somebody doesn't feel like a project, if we can get them to de-escalate, the hope is that with that will become increased awareness. For starters, Wade, just bodily, right? I know very well what it's like to go through performance experiences incredibly tense, and truly not have, well, two things. No awareness in the moment that it's problematically pushed or otherwise. But then secondarily, having a high enough cortisol level during that experience that I don't really remember it, right? So I wasn't really experiencing it in the moment, and I don't really have a great memory of it after the fact. So I'm then suddenly stuck with somebody telling me, is that really the best way to approach this or that or otherwise? And even worse, if they've gotten praise for the tight belting that you're talking about, either at the high school level or beyond, it becomes even harder, because that mindset is like they're just jumping through the hoop, right? And they're so narrowly fixated on, am I doing the thing, that they're not aware. So we do things to de-escalate in those moments, do repeated things that encourage greater bodily awareness, with the belief that ultimately, in the inner game of tennis, Galway talks about this a great deal. The idea that with heightened awareness and receptivity to change, the body will often find a path of less resistance. We don't like to be uncomfortable. And ultimately, even if it sounds good, like I like to say, it doesn't matter how you sound, it's how you sound. It's the process, not the product, right? So finding ways to cultivate awareness, in theory, will help people naturally move towards approaches that are freer. And then if they get to a moment where like, oh my gosh, this feels awful, I can't get out of it, then suddenly you've got somebody really invested in what you have to say as a teacher. So you're guiding them into experiences that hopefully feel better, with the understanding that ultimately that's what they're going to choose on their own. The other possibility, anyway, is just developing awareness through observation. If you have the capacity to have a studio class, I don't have a studio class right now, which is just such a tragedy. but oftentimes it's the whole, don't do as I do as I say kind of thing. We often are way more perceptive regarding what other people are doing than what we're doing. So encouraging people to reflect on ease, etc. Even outside of the context of studio class, sometimes I've resorted to like side-by-side YouTube videos and just saying, this isn't a qualitative thing. I'm not saying these are both great singers, but what is your experience just watching them? And sometimes I've actually turned the sound off And like you turn the sound off and they just watch a singer and make observations, then turn the sound on. And it's just encouraging a state that is the most receptive to feedback. Then that's internal feedback as well as external feedback. Increasing awareness and trusting that ultimately we don't really want to do things the hard way.
Thank you, Ben. Did that answer your question, Wade? Great. Anything else? I know we've hit our time. Y'all, this has been a lovely day. Thank you to everyone who presented for the work that went into getting those things ready, for the research that led to them. Thank you to all who were present to attend to our research. I think I can speak for all presenters when I say we really appreciate getting to talk about the things that we like to geek out about, and it's always really fun to be with other geeks who like it too. So thank you for geeking out with us today.